Welcome to Reimagining Liberty, a show about the emancipatory and cosmopolitan case for radical social, political, and economic liberalism. I'm Aaron Ross Powell. The right-wing ideologies we see most active in the world right now aren't intellectual by any stretch of the imagination. But there is a rich tradition of conservative political and social philosophy, and as liberals, it's important to understand what its objections to liberalism look like. Reimagining Liberty stalwart Matthew McManus, a lecturer in political science at the University of Michigan, wrote an article for Liberal Currents not too long ago about the philosopher Roger Scruton's criticism of liberalism from a conservative perspective. Scruton's work, because of its erudition, accessibility, and exemplariness, is perfect for understanding the philosophical conservative perspective. So today, Matt and I use Scruton's ideas as a way to interrogate the intellectual conservative tradition, and to argue that conservative philosophy aims less at a society organized around truth than it does a society where certainty rarely faces challenge. Reimagining Liberty is a listener-supported show. If you'd like to listen to episodes uninterrupted by ads from our sponsors, you can become a supporter. You'll get my newsletter ad-free as well. To learn more, head to www.reimaginingliberty.com. With that, let's turn to my conversation with Matt. What does Roger Scruton mean by conservatism, and how does he distinguish that from what he means by liberalism?
Sure. Well, first off, it's great to be back here. Like I said, I think I should get one of those special guest tags at this point. But Scruton, for those who don't know, was a very prominent English philosopher who wrote an enormous number of books, articles, contributions, you name it, between mostly the 1980s up until the 2020s when he passed away, right? Massively prolific, right? But I still think that the best account of conservatism, or at least the most honest account of conservatism that he gave, was in his early work, The Meaning of Conservatism, which is, I should add, also the one that is typically the most cited. And there he claims that core to the conservative outlook is the idea of allegiance, right? The idea that people should defer to the authorities into which they are born. Now, I want to be very clear. That does not mean, shall we put it, uncompromising allegiance. He does countenance that there are certain kinds of moments where resistance might be warranted. A very good example that he lived up to in his own life is Scruton was certainly very happy to see the communist states disappear, and certainly didn't think that people who were actively resistant to communist rule owed any debt of allegiance to something like, Stalin or Mao or whoever it happens to be. But by and large, you should defer to the authorities into which you're born. And that's very different than the liberal outlook as he understands it. And for that matter, the socialist outlook, which he also directed himself against. Yes, as a liberal socialist, I'm going to briefly talk about that, right? So Scruton tends to understand liberalism as committed to two core principles. This is again from The Meaning of Conservatism. The first is the idea of liberty or license. There's a lot of different terms for this. The idea that people should more or less be free to live their own life without interference, certainly from the state, but also from society. And he associates that with a commitment to a kind of equality, because he says that the respect for personal liberty that is owed to each individual, liberals by and large tend to think is owed to each individual equally, regardless of class, racial background, gender, certainly by the 2020s, sexual orientation, you name it, right? And socialism, he thinks, has a kind of elective affinity with liberalism, although he's much more sympathetic to the liberal tradition, and adopting a materialist, by and large, secular attitude towards the world that owes a great debt to the Enlightenment. The difference is that he thinks that socialists actually have an insight that liberals lack in recognizing the social nature of human beings. But of course, he's extremely critical of how this understanding of the social nature of human beings is eventually weaponized or operationalized to call for social ownership of the means of production, destruction of all private property relations, and of course, the elevation of the collective, understood very abstractly, right, over and above the particularities of different communities.
Where does he get or drive the authority that we have allegiance to. Because as you're describing this, set aside anarchists. Liberals, a liberal society is one of allegiance to the institutions of a liberal society. The governing institutions, the social institutions, which are deeply embedded with a set of values that underpin our commitment to liberalism, in the sense of we have a shared commitment to enabling people to live the kinds of lives that they want to live and celebrating a society that grants each of us those rights and possibilities, and we don't undermine the institutions that protect such a society and so on. Like it is not a world where just literally everyone sits by themselves on their homestead and never interacts with anyone. And so this is always, I think, my issue with a lot of conservatism is it seems to sneak in a very particular set of values by way of arguing that anything that is not those values is necessarily valueless. So instead of really arguing for, like, these are the correct set of values we should live by, it says these are the only values that are available to us, and anyone who rejects them is just rejecting, like, the notion of value, or is rejecting the notion of allegiance to institutions and society, or is rejecting the very notion of society itself. What is he grounding this particular distinction he's making?
Well, I don't want to rant for too long. So can we put a pin in that comment about what is this grounded in? Because I think that's an extremely important question. And it's going to get back to my, I think was the core point that I want to make about his endorsement of unthinking people, which, by the way, is his term, not mine. So don't claim that, I'm bad-mouthing him or showing bias towards him. But first, let's talk about, the kind of theoretical basis of allegiance and how this kind of cashes itself out. So again, I want to add, Scruton is a remarkably erudite person, right? In fact, it's very difficult to read his work and not be impressed by the sophisticated takes on Marx, Adorno, Sartre, Robert Nozick, F.A. Hayek. He has a wide array of theoretical influences. Probably the three most significant are Immanuel Kant, with whom he has a very clear love-hate relationship, Edmund Burke, who is lauds consistently throughout the course of his work. But interestingly enough, by the time we get to Conservatism, An Invitation to the Great Tradition, which is a late work introducing audiences to the moderate conservative tradition, which I want to say, just to be a bit critical here, is a bit sneaky, since a lot of the weirder and more far-right, unusual, eccentric figures that you see in right-wing thought are pretty much banished from this telling, right? It's a very polite, dare I say, even politically correct narration on the history of conservative thought, scrub screen of its more problematic elements. But there he actually lauds Hegel as the greatest and most systematic conservative thinker of all time, right? And that might seem a little bit unusual to American audiences, since I know many in the United States, I'm thinking about a discussion Charlie Kirk once had where he, or Ben Shapiro, right, where they both misused Hegel, right? Many American audience still associate Hegel with collectivism, Marxism, if they are familiar with them at all. But actually, there's a very rich tradition of conservative British Hegelianism that runs through F.H. Bradley, through people like Michael Oakeshott, up until people like Roger Scruton. And what Scruton argues, and I'll make this concrete in a second, is that we come into the world with unchosen obligations or duties towards others. It's not the case that all of the duties that we owe to others are chosen or are voluntary, the way he thinks, at least. Many liberals assume they're voluntary. So, for instance, you are born into a family and you owe obligations and duties of allegiance to your parents for a long period of time. The same he thinks is true of the community in which you're born. Think about, teachers or the priest that's, in your village, right? You owe an obligation to be at least respectful of them and potentially even to take seriously their advice about what's going to be good for you. And he extends this all the way up to the nation state, right? And the idea being that you owe a duty of allegiance and obedience to the nation state and the traditions of authority in that nation state into which you are born. And he associates this with Hegel's idea of ethical life. And he gives it something of a quasi-liberal twist, rather like some people interpret Hegel as doing, where he says, this is in fact not contrary to freedom, because the ethical life that is constituted by a community is actually an expression of that community's freedom. And an expression, for that matter, of its identity, or an affirmation of its identity, if you want. So there's nothing contrary to having to subordinate yourself to these kinds of ethical norms, respecting authority, and your own personal freedom, right? Because this is essentially what you would choose to do if you are a genuinely ethical person and were willing to take seriously the duties that you owe onto others, right? Now, I personally think that this is a gross misreading of Hegel, as I make clear in my little essay, right? I follow actually Waller Newell, who himself is quite a conservative guy, Straussian, right? And insisting that Hegel is actually probably best understood as initially a radical liberal, right? Very much a proponent of the French Revolution. And even by the time of his late work on the philosophy of right, I think it's pretty clear that he's a moderate liberal, supports reformism, thinks that a more representative style of government will be important, that will be also aligned with a commitment to more personal liberties, certainly than what you saw in the Prussian state. But again, there's no doubt that when Scruton reads Hegel in this way, and Burke for that matter, he's very much kind of aligning himself with a long tradition of British conservative thought.
I am not a Hegel scholar by any means, but it seems to me that the core idea—
It's not your beach reading, crack open the Phenomenology of Spirit, drinking a margarita or something. You're like, oh yeah, that Geist which realizes itself in its negative.
Yes, exactly. It seems to me that the core idea that Hegel is known for among people who are, if you know one thing about Hegel, it's this, is the dialectic and thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That by itself seems anti-conservative in a kind of social values. Scruton's big on traditions because it's entirely a philosophy of constant evolution and change. That here's the way we did things, then someone proposes this other way of doing things that's very, very radical, like very distinct and radical from it. We don't end up following either of those paths, but some synthesis of the two, but that resets the baseline and we just keep going. And this isn't, maybe there's a progress happens or change happens at a more measured pace because it's like from synthesis to synthesis to synthesis. But that doesn't seem very conservative to me. That seems like a system where everything, every truth, every principle, every way of being is constantly being upset and shifted and interrogated and updated.
Yeah, without a doubt, right? And I don't want us to get too far into the weeds of Hegelian scholarship and what the right interpretation of Hegel is, because I can already hear a gigantic chorus of voices being like, no, there is one right interpretation of Hegel and it's mine, not everyone else's, right? But by and large, there are different interpretations of Hegel. Two of the most standard are right Hegelianism and left Hegelianism, or right Hegelianism and young Hegelianism, right, which emerged during Hegel's own lifetime and certainly afterwards, right? By and large, left Hegelians tend to emphasize exactly the qualities in his work that you are, right? This idea that negation is always going to be a present factor in all human life and indeed all human society. The passing of something into its opposite or its transition into something new for that matter. There's no escaping this. And indeed, from the young Hegelian or left Hegelian perspective, this is actually a useful thing, right? Because it allows society to advance forward and for freedom and self-consciousness to become richer and deeper. And I should just lay my own cards on the table. I think that is the correct interpretation of Hegel. But by and large, right, we don't need to get into minutiae. Right Hegelians tend to take a different standpoint, again, leaning very heavily on the philosophy of right, some of the works on religion and aesthetics, which again, I want to point out Scruton was very familiar with, right? Emphasizing instead our need for ethical integration into the community, which is going to be stable and enduring over time so that we have a good sense of what our self happens to be without it constantly kind of dissolving into the morass of world complications. And emphasizing the importance of institutions, both again for enabling us to be free, at least in a peculiar kind of way, and expressing our identity as a nation, indeed, as a people, right? Now, Scruton sometimes seems to accept what it is that you're talking about. I want to be clear about this, where he says, look, the reality is that there's sometimes a tragic dimension that one can associate with conservatism. This is from his book, How to Be a Conservative, I think. I read a long time ago, where he says, look, the reality is that the world is characterized by entropy. Change is a constant. There's really no avoiding it. But there's this very strong human impulse, he thinks, to want to conserve what it is that we can, to keep things the same because we value and treasure them as what they are. And he thinks that even if it's the case that we can never completely be successful at this, something is not necessarily beautiful just because it lasts, to quote Joss Whedon from Avengers Age of Ultron.
You mentioned entropy, and that's something else I pick up on. And so this is, like I said, in the framing of this conversation we're having is Scruton is kind of exemplary of a conservative way of thinking about things. And it's one that I find basically just entirely unpersuasive.
Sure, me too.
And one aspect of that is he talks a lot about entropy and that there's a move towards entropy. But I think it's pretty clear that he doesn't actually mean entropy, because entropy isn't change. Entropy is increasing disorder.
Mm-hmm.
Is just kind of things falling apart. But that's not actually what we see. What we see is old orders shifting into new orders, which shift into new orders. And in a sense, this gets back to the critique that I raised earlier of what he wants to do is argue that his particular system of values is the only game in town, right, by arguing that anything that is a different system of values is like definitionally not actually a system of values. And I think there's a similar thing going on here where what he wants to, he has a particular conception of the right order, which I would argue is largely just a matter of preference and taste, not really principle. And anything that is not that order, rather than being a different one that you could argue against, you could say that alternative order is not as good. We could have that argument. But instead, he just wants to say any order that is different from this one is definitionally disorder.
Yeah, without a doubt, right? So this is one of the things that I point out in my essay and also in some of my other works on him, right? I think that he is correct that there's a human impulse for community or to want community. And without a doubt, there's also a human preference for order over disorder, right? I don't think that anybody would argue against it. Every now and then you will encounter maybe a Joker type figure who relishes in chaos, but that's an eccentricity in human nature. Although I think it's one that's sometimes valued, not in this kind of a Joker-like form, but maybe it's kind of a bohemian, artistic, expressive dimensions. But when you read Scruton's work closely, it's very clear that what he's talking about is not just any kind of order, but a very particular kind of order. To go back to my earlier point, many people try to object to this emphasis on order, not necessarily on his part, but on the part of traditionalist conservatives by saying, well, if what matters is demonstrating allegiance to the society into which you are born, why is it that we should be agitating so stridently for the fall of the Soviet Union, right? This is a society that's existed for almost a century now. The vast majority of people who live in the Soviet Union were born into it. Eroding the Soviet Union or ending the Soviet Union is going to bring about mass disorder in one of the world's largest states, which is exactly what happened, to be clear, right? So shouldn't your argument be that we should support this? Now, I want to be clear. I am not in any way saying that we should have saved the Soviet Union, right? But it's noteworthy, again, that Scruton would never have endorsed such a view because what he was fixated on was the right kind of order, not just order for its own sake. And the kind of order that he is proposing is one that is very clearly hierarchical and authoritarian in a certain kind of way, right? Not in a very strong, stringent way, but, without a doubt, there's those kind of qualities to that. And again, you don't need to take my word for it. Look at the meaning of conservatism. He was very comfortable offering apologias for figures like Augusto Pinochet or even Franco, saying, yes, these might be revolutionary figures in a certain sense, and without a doubt, they carried out excesses, right? I don't want to argue he was kind of an unthinking proponent of these kind of views. But he says, these kinds of conservative figures were pushed to revolution against their own better instincts by the kind of order that leftists were trying to establish, even in democratically, right? And consequently, there was a kind of legitimacy to these efforts to move back towards or to create a better kind of order that is much more focused again on tradition, respect for property, et cetera, et cetera. And this carried through to the end of his life. Viktor Orban was quite friendly with Roger Scruton. Scruton had cautious but somewhat warm relations with the regime that was being established in Budapest. And again, this should all be taken as an indication that he is not necessarily hostile to the idea of transformative change to bring about the right kind of order that he thinks is appropriate, which is one that is certainly much more authoritarian than any liberal would be comfortable with, and certainly much more authoritarian than I think I would be comfortable with.
Yeah, I think about that in our contemporary context of, so I think that liberalism is just in the water of, say, the United States and the Western world. They have been broadly what we could call liberal societies. The cultural and social values have been broadly liberal. You know, even the people who have kind of conservative social preferences typically don't want to see those enforced at the point of a gun. So take the anti-trans stuff. Like, you poll Americans, a lot of them are like uncomfortable with trans identities or the place of trans people in, you know, in pop culture or whatever it happens to be. But they also are just like, but I don't want the state. I oppose these interventions to banish them from everyday life. I just kind of like, let people live and let live. And that's a liberal value.
I mean, it's one I adopt myself, right? I mean, I don't particularly want to go live in a town filled with Christian evangelicals, right? But I don't begrudge Christian evangelicals the right to cohabitate with one another, establish communities, and more or less do what they wish. I'm just not going to be coming to their church anytime soon.
Yes, and I think that's the way most people think. But what I notice is there are a lot of people who want to think of themselves as still being kind of broadly in the liberal tradition, but say, like, they're really upset that their grandkids have different values than they do and are telling them, you know, Grandpa, you can't use the R word anymore. It's not acceptable. Or they've gone woke or whatever. And they want to do that in a way that isn't just saying, like, look, I'm a social reactionary and I've rejected all of liberalism and I want to just compel my grandkids to not criticize me and my ways. But they do it, and this, I think, mirrors to some extent the, like, sneaking the values in without arguing for them that Scruton and I think much of conservative philosophy does. They do it by saying, well, in a state of actual, like, liberal freedom, my grandkids wouldn't believe this. They would agree with me. They would share my values. They'd have my commitment to the social hierarchies that I prefer, the social patterns that I prefer, because I feel like I arrived at those in a state of freedom. Most of us aren't aware of the cultural embeddedness of our own beliefs or the cultural contingency because they feel freely chosen to a great extent. And so instead what they say is it must have been some corrupting thing that did it. It was something, it was actually like a state of unfreedom that led to my grandkids disagreeing with me or increasing secularization or the fact that people are listening to rock and roll instead of classical music on the radio.
Alan Bloom's famous thesis, right? You know, Mick Jagger's, you know, wagging hips and pelvis, right, are just going to radically transform everybody into little left-wing Heideggerians.
Exactly. Yes, it is that, or it is their teachers are indoctrinating them, their professors are indoctrinating them. Hollywood controlled by, pick your favorite euphemism for the undesirables, is indoctrinating them. That it's some, like, nefarious influence, and so they're not really free. That in, again, if they were, like, free to choose in a liberal way, they would choose to live the way that I prefer as opposed to the way that they prefer. And again, I think this is, like, my frustration with a lot of conservative arguments is that's a conversation, like the conversation about the comparative value of value systems is one that we can definitely have. And so you can say, is it better for kids to be raised in this kind of family versus that kind of family? Or is it better to learn the great books versus new canons of literature in terms of understanding the nature of the human condition. And so, like, we can have all these conversations, but there seems to just be this real desire to dodge those conversations, to try to shift it onto actually it's nefarious influences, actually it's entropy instead of a different order, actually it's a lack of values instead of a different set of values. And I feel like a lot of that is driven by the fact that conservatism is simply losing on the social, like, if Scruton and other conservatives wouldn't be mad about the state of liberalism if people freely choosing were choosing to live conservative lives. But the fact is, like, every generation chooses lives different than their parents, and their parents are upset about it. And so partly, like, I found your article interesting because it was like, here's one of the, as you said, most erudite, smartest, he certainly is much more widely and well-read than I am, guys in, like, the conservative tradition, but it feels like when you peel back the layers, there's just not much there beyond the kids these days.
Well, without a doubt, right? I mean, he had moments like that in abundance. Let's put it this way, right? Up until like the 2010s, he was still railing against Lady Gaga and the fact that, the popularity of your music represented the decline of culture. He inveighed against rock music, except for Metallica, oddly enough. He seemed to have a taste for them, which I always found at least somewhat charming, right? He once said, yes, there is even a hierarchy of taste within pop music, right? It's like, well, if there's going to be a hierarchy of taste within pop music and Metallica's at the top, I'm reasonably comfortable with that. But look, there's a lot to be said there. I mean, that comment was jam-packed, so I think I'm going to break this up into little bits, right? So one of the things that I really admire about Scruton is his uncommon honesty and being overt about his own viewpoint. So just to give an example, in The Meaning of Conservatism, I think he actually addresses your point very directly. And this brings me to my point about unthinking people, where he overtly says there is something that is extremely admirable about unthinking people who, accepting of the burdens that life imposes upon them, do not seek to politicize their own problems, right? But bear them with a certain kind of grace and dignity. Now, there's a long-standing history of conservatives adopting or defending a kind of anti-intellectualist stance, right? Think about, Edmund Burke ruminating in Parliament about how disappointing it is when people look too deeply into the origins, or the historical origins, I should say, of nations. That's a bad thing because it means that people start to question the legitimacy of the society into which they're born. We shouldn't do that, right? Or Joseph de Maistre, who I referenced in the text, who said, reason is fundamentally a destructive force because we need to approach our political and religious convictions like dogmas. And anybody who opens them too much to question, especially for the masses, is going to corrode or disintegrate the basis of society, right? But Scruton is uncommonly candid, where he says, for ordinary people, they do not have reasons for the positions that they hold. They tend to take the traditions into which they are born as authoritative, and that is enough. And what he thinks is so problematic is, had human nature been left more or less as it is, everyone would be content with that, right? They would not question authority structures. They would more or less live lives that are homologous to other members of their community and their nation, and they would be accepting of that. Then along come these leftists, liberal and libertarian, tip of the hat to our host right now, intellectuals who constantly say, well, what are the reasons for these traditions? Do they actually service everyone? Is this defense of traditional marriage actually a defense of traditional marriage, or is it a defense of patriarchal social relations or heteronormative social relations, and should we question that? So Scruton says there's a reason why a lot of people who are attracted to intellectualism tend to move towards the left or towards liberalism, and it's precisely because they want reasons for everything. And he does not think that people need to give you reasons, or for that matter, authorities need to give you reasons for why they exist, right? But because there are so many left and liberal intellectuals right now, as you point out, the problem is the culture is gradually moving their way, which is why you need conservative intellectuals to rise to the fore to, in his famous phrase, give you reasons for not having reasons, right? Which he takes to be the deepest kind of indicator of wisdom, and again associates that with Hegelianism. Now, I think that this is entirely a vapid way of defending life, partly for Hegelian reasons, right? I think that individuals who arrive at a higher level of self-consciousness about the kind of society that they live within, and aren't necessarily critical, but at least reflective about whether or not it corresponds to a deeper and more considered set of values. That is a richer mode of being, and is also one that is more likely to be conducive to a society that is genuinely committed to justice, because it's willing to reform or even radically transform relationships of domination that are not conducive, or for that matter, hegemony that is not conducive to the well-being of many of its members, right? And Scruton is fundamentally just very hostile to that, right? Uh, Even though at times, to be fair, he does gesture towards its importance. And I think he was a bit not taciturn. I think that kind of implies that this was performative. I think he genuinely at points had a certain level of admiration for the best elements of the liberal tradition that he was unable to entirely wean himself off of. Just to give two quick examples to try to offset my earlier characterization of some of his impulses as an authoritarian, he was a lifelong admirer of Kant, wrote a very good introduction to Kant for Oxford University, expresses a great deal of appreciation for how Kant has taught us how to appreciate things like art, for example. And, also in The Soul of the World, he defended a kind of approach to natural rights or universal rights, saying, look, by and large, it's a bad thing if we have to use force to compel people to live lives that they don't necessarily want to, and maybe they should just be left alone. Although that kind of universalistic sentiment never extended to things like mobility rights for immigrants who might very well want to move to the United Kingdom or the United States to pursue a better life for them. And there he thinks, again, if people don't want their communities to be changed, it's absolutely their entitlement to tell their fellow rights bearers, no, go back home to Syria and die if you need to, if that's the only thing available to you.
But again, even here, and this gets back, my central point is, to some extent, I want to say, like, conservatism as it is intellectualized in these ways is not actually pointing to something real. And what I mean by that is, the first, let's start with the like unthinking person. So we don't live in a world where the unthinking people, in the sense of like they didn't go through this liberal process of examining the society that they were born into and its systems and values and institutions and hierarchies, and then interrogating all of them, choosing which ones aligned with their individualized sense of self-authorship, and sticking with those, but then trying different things in these experiments, million experiments in living. And most of us are internalize whatever is in the water as kind of the truth of how things ought to be. I think, one of the really fascinating things being a parent is watching your kids cycle through fads without realizing that they're doing it. So I bug my kids because what I love to do is use their slang, but not the slang they're using right now, the slang they were using 1 year ago, but have stopped using. And it drives them nuts because I'll say something and they'll be like, no one says that. It's like, you said that a year ago. No, Dad, we didn't. Or the same thing with clothes, like no one's wearing that anymore. And it's like, well, why? How did that change? And they're like unaware of kind of how much they're just buoyed along in the currents of pop culture fads and TikTok influencers and so on. And there's
as do we all, right? I remember looking at a picture of myself from like 15 years ago and had like long hair and a tan because I was working outdoors all the time. I was like, I guess I had like my bratty beach phase, right? Not exactly a great look, I'm not going to lie. But
yes, we all look back at, pictures of what I looked like in middle school are incredibly cringy. But I mean, so that's the life that we actually lead. But the objection seems to be not then that like people are thinking too much in a liberal way and choosing things different than the eternal traditions and values and truths of a conservative framework. It's that everything is constantly changing and people are buoyed along by it. And so when I say that like conservatism in the way that this is conceptualized doesn't exist, is it seems to be that the conservative philosophical view is there are things called traditions. that have been around in a stable way, and there are things called hierarchies that have been around in a stable way, and that those are natural in some sense because of their persistence, when that's just not true. It is a like it's almost to use like linguistic terms, like they think that like a synchronic moment, like a moment in time, a slice in time, is representative of like the whole of history, but it's not. Like even this moment is the conservatism that we have, the traditions that are eternal and natural today would have been horrific in a like what are the kids up to sense to people 100, 200, 500 years ago. The Christianity say that like this is the way that we should practice our religion. Every Christianity today looks nothing like the Christianities of the 1400s or the Christianity of Jesus's time, right? It just like it seems to be that's it's almost like there's just no sense of history, and there's no sense of like cultural and historical antecedents to the moment we're in. It's just like these are eternal principles, and so it's a way that like doesn't take into account that even the conservative is like in that same buoyed along by the fads of change that they're criticizing the liberals for.
Yeah, without a doubt. I got to say, Aaron, you got to be careful if you start historicizing that much. You're going to wind up becoming a Marxist, in about another month or so. And I say that as somebody because Marx used to pride himself exactly on this, right? All the reactionaries were bugged by the historical dialectic, or scandalized, as I think Engels put it, precisely because it kind of exposed the contingency of moral worldviews and the historicity of social institutions and practices. We don't need to get in there, though. Anyway, I just to kind of answer that, I think that's a very insightful point, right? And this is where I'll digress a little bit from Scruton to make a more general kind of observation about the conservative tradition, or the right-wing tradition for that matter. I think that you're absolutely right to point out that they invariably tend to ascribe a kind of metaphysical or even providential necessity to social institutions and practices into which we are born, right? Or, if not into which we are born, the kinds of social hierarchies and authoritative structures that they would like to see brought about. Because again, there are many right-wing radicals out there, but they almost invariably will say, look, they're but for the corruption that exists in society right now. The proper kind of hierarchy would be expressing itself. So we need to go back to that, or restore it, or establish it, or whatever it happens to be. Invariably, this tends to be aligned with this deep metaphysical yearning for a sense of order, which is associated with hierarchy and authority, right? The great Canadian Charles Taylor characterizes this as a commitment to a social imaginary that's predicated on hierarchical complementarity, the idea that there's supposed to be a pyramid, right? There's some people in society that belong at the bottom, some in the middle, and then the people at the top who are entitled to enormous amounts of agency and enormous amounts of power, precisely because they know how to make things go best. And you see it in a lot of the kind of imagery that conservatives are very attracted to, right? The idea of a stern God the Father ordering history and ordering society the way it's supposed to be, or, even more contemporaneously, the idea of a CEO in chief in Curtis Yarvin, right? Who is entitled to govern society like an absolute monarch because he is a more productive and creative individual, as opposed to the vulgar masses who, in his recent terminology, suck and will be better off just kind of doing what they're told, right? And very often, the arguments actually given for why these kinds of hierarchical modes of organization are the embodiment or the instantiation of eternal, let alone providential truths, are extremely weak, if they're even present at all. Very often, there's not even an attempt to give an argument for this. It's kind of a Jordan Peterson-like approach of, well, what else are you going to do? You have to believe in something like this because there needs to be a sense of order in the universe. And this is why, in a piece I wrote for a blog on postmodernity, I said that what conservatives are fundamentally committed to very often is not truth, but certainty. And the two are very different, right? Certainty is this conviction that you understand the world the way that it is, that you have a conscious apprehension of how it is ordered, and consequently you can navigate your way safely within it, right? And I don't think that there's anything necessarily wrong with a yearning for certainty in some circumstances. Again, I think the ordinary person pretty much wants to know that when they go outside, the whole city isn't going to be burning down and that they can cross the street and that, green light means go and all that kind of things. But an excess yearning for certainty, let alone the ascription of providential or sacral qualities onto the view of order and authority that you take to be important, sometimes this can almost get kind of comical, right? Because it's so clearly based in this kind of emotional yearning. And I always point out that what's much more consonant with a liberal, and for that matter, I'd add often socialist view, is again not a rejection of the idea that there are transhistorical truths, logical truths, mathematical truths, moral truths, but the idea that we are fallible, and consequently, we always have to be engaged in critical self-reflection and dialogue with one another to arrive closer and closer at an approximation of what the truth happens to be. And so society will be better off giving people quite a high degree of liberty and equality so that they can have these discussions with one another, or to invoke your experiments in living metaphor, so that we can experiment with many different forms of life to see which ones are most appropriate for certain kinds of human beings. Because there's also recognition that people are fundamentally different and not everybody wants to live the same kind of lifestyle. And this is an impulse that I would argue goes all the way back to Socrates, with this idea that the wise person is someone who is not indifferent to eternal truth and the sacred, but is cognizant of the fact that he is not in possession of it, yes, and needs to be constantly self-critical and constantly in dialogue with other members of his city in order to reach it. And it's very worth noting that in a telling piece, Wilmore Kendall, the great conservative author, American author, once said that the Athenians were absolutely right to execute Socrates. Why? Because he was undermining faith in the gods of the city, and he was undermining the patriotism that is necessary for a community to hold itself together. Was he doing something useful? And is it the case that this really was the best city and it really was, doing all the right things? Sure. If he was doing something useful, that's not the case that's the best city. And it's not the case that the gods of the city are necessarily really existent. But most ordinary people don't need to think that much about it. And so the authorities in Athens at the time were absolutely right to execute Socrates, right? And I think that's, again, a very candid admission of what a lot of these people are really aiming for, right? They want an unthinking population that is going to accept the authorities into which they are born. And they think that this is, by and large, going to make everything go better because we want a sense of order and certainty in the world. Even if that order certainly doesn't actually correspond to anything we've proven to be true, it's still better pragmatically that we just defer to it than open ourselves to an endless conversation and endless disputes where no one's going to know or what's true and what's false, and where, more importantly, no one's going to know what their place is.
Let me close with this question then. We have spent now 40 minutes being pretty critical of Roger Scruton and pretty critical of the broader genre of conservative philosophy that he is representative of. So that said, you've read a lot of Scruton. You continue to read.
Whole bookshelf dedicated to him back there, actually.
You read a lot of conservative philosophy. What's the value in it? I guess the short way of answering this is, given everything we just discussed, why should someone read Roger Scruton at all?
Sure. Well, Scruton, in How to Be a Conservative, had a couple sections on the truth of socialism or the truth of liberalism. And some of these were actually quite charitable. So I think it's appropriate that we end with this. And that in itself is the beginning of the answer to your question, right? I think that one of the things that's really remarkable at Scruton isn't just his erudition, but precisely the fact that, contra what I just suggested, he was very much an open-minded kind of conservative, right? Which might seem paradoxical, but it's true, right? And this is probably in part because he felt compelled to argue against the advancing forces of liberalism, socialism, Marxism, postmodernism. But compare his work on Sartre or on, somebody like Kant, right? To Jordan Peterson, Gad Saad, Mark Levin, let alone, most conservative influencers. And it's far and away more impressive, which really provokes a challenge from people who hold differing views to conservatives, because unlike a lot of these figures who it's just very easy to dismiss and make fun of, his work genuinely requires a considered response from people who are opposed to his worldview, which is definitely not what you can say about a lot of conservative intellectuals right now. I guess the second thing that I really admire about him that actually a lot of us could learn from, and myself included, right, is Scruton was just a brilliant writer, right? His prose is filled with wit and salt and gravitas. It's relatively accessible for an academic work, and it's always aimed at giving you a sense of what is most important about whatever subject it's analyzing. It's never trivial or slight, right? And I think that a lot of us would benefit from, if not trying to emulate that style exactly, trying to figure out how to instantiate some of its virtues in our own writing. Because I think that a lot of liberal defenses of liberalism sometimes have this almost glib quality to them, right? Suggesting this is not normal, or why is it that people are opposed to freedom, without ever giving an articulate defense about why freedom is valuable, or why it is that we should be committed to a more humble and fallibilistic approach to truth, et cetera, et cetera. And then I guess just the last thing that I'd like to highlight is his work is extremely creative in offering a comprehensive defense of the conservative tradition, a kind of Tory-ish conservatism, I want to add, right? He was willing to draw from idiosyncratic sources. He was willing to engage with conservative traditions that many people, for instance, in the United States are not familiar with, and had mastered them all. And so there's a very unusually individuated quality to his work, in that it feels like it was really produced by a human being who thought deeply about what it is that he cares about. And there's something that is intellectually enriching about having to think with and think against somebody who's like that, who doesn't just settle for rote cliches or dogmas, ironically, right, given again what I just said, but is willing to think more carefully and think more deeply about what it is that he's trying to say. So I think that there's a lot that libertarians and liberals, and for that matter leftists, can gain from reading his work, even if the political program that it defended needs to be rejected and unambiguously rejected.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Reimagining Liberty. If you'd like to listen to future episodes free of ads and sponsorships, you can become a supporter for just a few dollars a month. Head to www.aaronrosspowell.com to learn more.